In the early months of 1945, the city of Berlin in Germany was no longer a place of control and authority. It had become a city under siege. Bombs fell from the sky, buildings were reduced to ruins, and the streets were filled with fear. What once stood as the center of power in Europe had now become a place where survival was uncertain. The sound of explosions became part of daily life, and the future of the city grew darker with each passing day. From the east, the Soviet army moved closer, advancing through Poland and into German territory with force and determination. From the west, Allied forces pushed forward through France and into Germany. Berlin was no longer protected by distance, it was now the center of a tightening circle. Every direction brought pressure, every direction brought danger. The city was slowly being surrounded, and there was no clear path of escape. Inside Berlin, the situation for civilians became desperate. Food supplies were limited, water became harder to access. Movement through the city became dangerous as fighting spread across neighborhoods. Families stayed hidden, hoping to survive another day. The sense of fear was constant, and the idea of safety seemed to disappear completely. Yet, even as the city collapsed above ground, decisions were still being made below. Beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, a hidden structure became the center of control. This underground complex, known as the Führerbunker, would become the final location where the last actions of leadership would take place. The Führerbunker was located beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, Germany. It was built to provide protection from air attacks, but by April 1945 it had become something else entirely. It was no longer just a shelter, it was the final headquarters where decisions were made as the war reached its end. Inside the bunker, space was limited. The rooms were small, the air felt heavy, and the atmosphere was filled with tension. Those inside were aware of what was happening above them. They could hear the distant sounds of explosions. They knew that the situation outside was becoming worse, yet they remained underground, separated from the full reality. Communication with the outside world became difficult. Reports came in, but they were often delayed or unclear. Information was incomplete. Decisions had to be made based on what was known, but what was known was not always accurate. This created a gap between what was believed and what was actually happening. As the days passed, the pressure increased. The people inside the bunker were not just dealing with external threats, they were dealing with uncertainty. They were dealing with the knowledge that the situation was changing rapidly and that time was running out. By April 1945, the Soviet army had reached the outskirts of Berlin. Their advance was steady and powerful. They moved through eastern Germany, closing in on the city from multiple directions. The distance between the front lines and the center of Berlin became smaller with each passing day. The fighting in Berlin intensified. Streets turned into battle zones, buildings became positions for defense and attack, movement became dangerous for both soldiers and civilians. The city was no longer functioning as it once did. It had become a battlefield. Inside the bunker, reports of the Soviet advance became more urgent. Each update confirmed the same reality. The situation was not improving. The forces defending Berlin were losing ground. The ability to control the situation was slipping away. This was not a sudden event. It was the result of months of pressure. The war had been turning for some time, and now it had reached its final stage. The Soviet forces were not just approaching Berlin, they were entering it. As the Soviet forces entered Berlin, the bunker became even more isolated. The people inside were cut off from direct contact with the outside world. They depended on reports that were not always complete. This isolation created a situation where decisions were made without full understanding of the reality outside. Inside the bunker, discussions continued. Plans were still being made, orders were still being given. but the ability to carry out those orders became limited. The connection between decision and action weakened as the situation outside changed rapidly. The contrast between inside and outside became clear. Inside there was structure, discussion, and planning. Outside there was chaos, destruction, and loss of control. The two realities were no longer aligned. As time passed, the sense of urgency grew stronger. The people inside the bunker began to understand that the situation could not be reversed. The focus shifted from control to survival, and from planning to facing what was coming next. By the final days of April 1945, Berlin was almost completely surrounded. The Soviet army had moved deep into the city. The sounds of fighting were no longer distant, they were close, very close. The bunker was no longer far from the front lines. Inside the bunker, the atmosphere changed. There was a growing awareness that the end was near. Discussions became more serious. Decisions became more urgent. The situation allowed for very few options. Preparations began for what would come next. These were not ordinary preparations. They were decisions made in a moment where time was limited and outcomes were uncertain. Every action carried weight, and as these final days continued, one thing became clear. The situation had reached a point where it could not be changed. The end was no longer a possibility, it was a certainty, and what would happen next would become one of the most discussed events in history. By the middle of April 1945, Berlin in Germany was no longer just under pressure, it was almost completely surrounded. Soviet forces had pushed through eastern Germany and entered the outskirts of the city. The distance between the front lines and the center of Berlin had become very small. What was once a distant threat was now directly at the gates. The Soviet army moved through districts such as Lichtenberg and Friedrichshain, closing in on central Berlin. Their advance was organized and determined. They faced resistance, but they continued forward. The city could no longer hold them back. Each day, they moved closer to the heart of Berlin. From the west, Allied forces had already entered Germany, advancing through areas such as the Rhine region and moving towards central territories. While they did not enter Berlin itself at this stage, their presence increased the pressure on Germany from all sides. The situation became one where there was no safe direction. Inside Berlin, movement became extremely dangerous. Streets were no longer safe, buildings were damaged or destroyed, civilians remained hidden as fighting intensified. The city had become a battlefield and its control was slipping away. Beneath the Reich Chancellery in central Berlin, the Führerbunker became the final location of leadership. By late April 1945, it was clear that this underground structure would be the center of the final events. Inside the bunker, space was limited and the atmosphere was tense. The rooms were small, and the air felt heavy. Those inside could hear the sounds of fighting above them. The war was no longer distant, it was happening directly above their position. Communication with the outside world became increasingly unreliable. Messages were delayed, reports were incomplete. The people inside the bunker had to rely on information that was often unclear. This made decision making extremely difficult. Despite this, discussions continued. Plans were still being made, orders were still given, but the ability to carry out these orders was weakening. The reality outside the bunker was changing faster than the decisions being made inside. By the last week of April 1945, the situation had reached a critical point. Soviet forces had entered central Berlin. Fighting was taking place near important locations such as the Reichstag building and the Brandenburg Gate inside the bunker. The awareness of the situation became clearer. There was a growing understanding that the outcome could not be changed. The focus shifted from control to what would happen next. Decisions were made under extreme pressure. These were not decisions about victory. They were decisions about the final moments. The options were limited, and every choice carried weight. The atmosphere inside the bunker changed. There was a sense of urgency and finality. The people inside knew that time was running out. The situation had moved beyond recovery. On the 30th day of April 1945, inside the Führerbunker in Berlin, Germany, the final events took place. By this time, Soviet forces were only a short distance away. The sound of fighting could be heard clearly above ground. Inside the bunker, preparations had already been made. The decisions taken at this moment were shaped by the understanding that there was no path forward. The situation had reached its end. The final hours were quiet compared to the chaos outside. There was no large movement, no major change, only the continuation of decisions that had already been set in motion. This moment would later become one of the most discussed events in modern history. What happened inside that bunker on that day would mark the end of a chapter that had shaped the world. Following these events, the situation in Berlin changed rapidly. Soviet forces took control of the city. The fighting continued for a short time, but the outcome was clear. Berlin had fallen. The war in Europe moved toward its conclusion. In early May 1945, Germany surrendered. The events in Berlin marked the final stage of the conflict in Europe. The city itself was left heavily damaged. Buildings were destroyed. Infrastructure was broken. The people who remained faced the challenge of rebuilding their lives in a city that had been changed completely. The events that took place in Berlin, Germany, in April 1945 remain a powerful example of how quickly situations can change. They show how decisions made under pressure can shape history and how even the strongest positions can reach a point where they cannot continue.